forget. Yeah, so we have tonight we have a bonus technique. But before we start the program, questions, comments, show and tell. Anyone want to
Here's my show and tell.
Yay, hot dog.
Yeah, I still have to stitch my lining hems in and do my buttonholes, but otherwise it's all done.
Great.
Wonderful.
Oh, here's another one.
So here's my show and tell.
Oh, gorgeous. Lovely color.
And I don't know if you can see the buttons.
Oh,
This is
I
the,
love those
I did the
Nice.
covered buttons and I did the
Oh, great.
snaps.
That's a great solution.
So because of the thickness and the snaps, I'm using the lining, the lining fabric.
Oh, beautiful.
And
Oh, you covered your snaps. Wow.
yeah,
Good for
I
you.
just used those plastic rings and did the fabric cover.
Yeah.
And then did the cuff,
Yep.
the cuff button the same way.
Beautiful.
And then the yarn that I used to make the braid, the twisted monk cord,
Mhm.
I'm going to knit a scarf out of.
Oh, nice.
So it'll have a matching scarf as well.
Wow, great.
The sleeves are a little shorter than I probably should have made them. I had trouble figuring out the sleeve length.
Okay.
And I had to take up, somebody else was talking about taking up the shoulder in the front.
Uh-huh.
I did that, so I'm not sure if I got the collar placement right.
Yeah, I think it looks good.
So,
I keep it.
but the thickness of the fabric was a challenge for the collar.
Mhm.
And the thinness of the lining, because I used a sari, a vintage sari
Okay.
for the silk lining, and it
Mhm.
was a little thinner.
Uh-huh.
But the truth is, I haven't sewn a garment in years.
Really?
So I moved to knitting because,
Okay.
and then I had to stop knitting because I had some hand issues.
Mhm.
But so this was really, really exciting to get a focus on techniques
Mhm.
and produce something that I'm pleased to wear in public.
Well, that's great. You did a great job. Congratulations. Okay, who else? Let's see.
I'm not
Looks
quite
like-
done, but I'm close. I
Okay.
did
Nice.
with my bound buttonholes, although I have a question. I didn't do a bound on the arm. Is it going to be is it going to matter? Because I'm hesitant about trying to do a bound now that the garment's almost done.
No.
Is it for traditional?
What I would just do is, you could just
Sew the button on?
sew the button on. Yeah.
Perfect,
That's fine. Too.
perfect. But
Yeah.
it turned out very, very nice. And I love
Does
fabric.
that fabric have a pattern embossed in it?
It does. It's and it's a
Very-
cotton, and I did a complete underlining with muslin because it was so there was no structure to it.
Mhm.
And that was my only challenge, but it turned out nicely. It's a little bit warm for South Florida, but I'm going to find time to wear it. And
Yeah.
so I was very excited because I have never sewn a garment like this in my life, and to have it come out this nicely, I am just thrilled.
Well, that's great.
So
It makes me feel good that I could somehow lure you back into the
You
garment
did.
sewing world.
you did.
Okay, anyone else? Oh,
I do. Yeah.
Cheryl. Okay, Cheryl,
So-
let's take a look here.
So this one, back up. That's the whole thing. It's raw silk. So it's
Uh-huh.
a raw silk suited fabric. I'll show you the lining in a moment. I did the bound buttonholes. I was happy. I did we talked and I wasn't afraid, and I did the welt pockets and they were
Good.
fine.
See?
For the top stitching, I played around with it, and then I just decided at the end of the day, because it's a thinner fabric of South Florida, right? So it's a thinner fabric. I just used the triple stitch on my Bernina,
Okay. Mhm.
embroidery thread in it, and it's okay. I mean, it doesn't stand out. It's okay. The buttons, I'm probably going to take the buttons off and change them into something else. But yeah, I think it's super comfy. It's nice and light.
So let's see the interior. Let's see the lining.
I love the lining.
Oh, that's
Wow.
beautiful. Yeah, that's gorgeous. Where did you find that? That lining?
The lining fabric came from just some little shop in Trinidad.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. In source unknown. I don't even know what's in it. I'm almost afraid. It's going to go to the dry cleaners, but but yeah, I'm happy with it.
Looks
Beautiful.
great.
And I learned so much. I mean, I mean, everything you do, Kenneth, I learned so much, but yeah, this has
Well,
been.
you know, see, I understand that you spend your hard-earned money and I want you to get some value. So I'm glad.
That's
you
wonderful.
enjoyed it.
Definitely worth it. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else want to do show and tell or comment or questions?
I have a question for Sally about, did you send your buttons off to have them done, or did you do them
No,
yourself?
I made them myself. You thank God for YouTube.
Yeah.
There's a YouTube about I think it's done by Bodkin Studios out of Canada, about how to do couture buttons, and it's really just you cut the fabric a little bit larger than the little plastic ring and stitch it around. Very simple. It's fiddly, but not difficult.
You know, that's something I teach my students in my couture construction class, in the embellishments class. And I remember one time someone was like, kind of turning their nose up at it. I'm like, okay, you know what? You're going to use this one day. And she emailed me years later. It was like, you are right. You know, it's like, yes, you know, you may turn your nose up at it and think it's a little bit crafty, but it's a legitimate technique,
Yeah.
you know, and you get a custom button that way.
Well, and which reminds you said something that triggered for me. I would love to learn more about embellishment,
Mhm.
because as I'm learning more, the pattern itself is a critical piece, but it's the embellishment that really lifts it.
Yeah.
And so I would love to learn more about how to do embellishments, custom embellishments, because I think that's really a creative aspect.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to find places that have more of that.
Mhm. Well, you know, I
so-
have the whole, you know, because I had to do all this online.
Yeah.
I have videos for that. So my June 1st deadline, like I can't think of any more classes until then, but after June 1st, the first one I'm going to run is the peplum jacket class.
Yes.
And then, you know, it's good to hear that and there's an interest in embellishments, because I have a lot of embellishments that I could do running like classes. Because I have a memory that I did that class. God, it was 100 years ago, but I could run it again. So yeah. So that's
Come on, Craftsy.
no, that was just one I did on Zoom.
Okay.
And I used you as an excuse
Okay.
to get a new old sewing machine, because the collar was so thick
Yeah.
that my little beginner sewing machine could not handle it.
Uh-huh.
So Spokane does not have a lot to offer in the way of sewing. Let's just be honest there. So I stopped at the store. They had a 1967 Kenmore
Okay.
that sews like a charm for
Mhm.
$150. So now I have this beautiful, it has you can lower the feed dogs, you can make all sorts of adjustments. Has the old cams, if anybody
Oh
remembers
yeah. Wow.
those.
Mhm.
But it just sews and it just went through all the layers of that collar with not a problem.
Well, you know, some of those old machines are great. And you know, like I've said, I do love the Singer 301A just for top. That's my top stitch machine.
Yeah.
That's what that machine does.
I haven't tried the top stitching thread yet in it.
You know,
but I will.
it could very well charge right through it, because those old machines will sew through just about anything.
It weighs about 50 pounds.
Yeah. Well, you see, the nice thing about that is when you get going, it doesn't kind of hop around on the table. It just sits there and just sews right through it.
Yeah.
Okay. So Lisa, go ahead.
I have a question for the ladies who just modeled their coats for us. Did any of you modify the collar from the pattern that Kenneth gave us? You did.
Yeah.
Okay. Judy, did you make it smaller?
I made
The points?
the points smaller, and what I did was I pulled out a ready-made jacket and kind of matched it up with that one, because I felt that ready-made sat nicely on my neck and shoulder. So I would say I brought the point in probably about an inch.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Now you
And
see
I
that,
modified mine, but from the center back, because
Mhm.
I shortened the front because I have rolled and forward shoulders. So I shortened the front at the raglan seam. And so I shifted the collar a little bit as well.
so now Judy made a really good point, and this is something I talk to my students about. You can use garments you have and you like as examples. You know, this is one thing. I have a student who was asking me about, do you know any good books for drafting a men's, classic men's like 3-panel jacket, 2-part sleeve? I said, do you have a jacket you can take a pattern from? And she kind of looked at me. I'm like, that's not cheating, young lady. I will send you the information on how to do it. That's not cheating. For something like that, why would you reinvent the wheel? So I have different garments in my collection that I use because I say that a library isn't just books. A library can be garments as well. And so you can use garments that you have, if you like a proportion of a sleeve or you like the shape of a collar or something like that, that's entirely kosher to take that particular information and graft it onto something else. That's just how we design.
But I don't feel so bad because I did that to do the shawl collar because I really struggled to get the right depth of that shawl collar. I didn't want it so big like yours was. And I found another pattern that actually came from your craftsy class.
Mhm. Yeah.
That had a much narrower, oh, we're just going to cheat a little bit to line this up.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. So yeah, see that's the object is you get what you want. And all is fair in love and war and in pattern making. If you get the garment that you want that makes you feel well in your clothes, then that's really the object. So yes, I'm good job, folks. Good job. So other questions or comments before we get to the show?
I have a question for Cheryl. Did you underline or how did you do the underside of your raw silk?
I interlined it with silk organza.
And okay, so you didn't stitch that down or anything?
I interlined it. So yeah, I interlined it with silk organza. So it treated all the pieces as one piece, the front with the silk suiting and then the silk organza as one.
Okay, all right. Would the raw silk be a case where you might want to do the iron on what is it, interfacing?
Diffusable?
The
Fusing, yeah, fusing.
I didn't want to do the block fusing on the body because I felt I like the drape I like the drape. So I wanted to keep the drape, but I did use fusible on the facing and I used it on the whole facing. I mean, all the neck, there were 2 different kinds I used, but I used fusible on that part.
Okay.
Yeah, but the rest of it was, the body was interlined.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, then, so the bonus lesson. This is making the hidden lining pockets. So there's a deep dive on piping to kind of as a little tutorial before we get into the hidden pocket, but it'll all make sense. And so as always, if you have questions, just give me a shout out and we'll stop the video and answer the question.
These are 2 jackets that I have constructed. The one on the left is what I call the new school construction. And the one on the right is old school or bespoke. Even though the linings install differently on these jackets, this hidden lining pocket installs exactly the same. So it is suitable for both kinds of construction. So let's have a look inside these jackets. I have this jacket opened on the table to show you first the lining, but also the lining pocket. You can see here, there is the opening. Let me show it to you up close. As you can see, there's a piping that joins the lining to the facing. And this is where we install the pocket. This makes it much easier to install a lining, or if you have to reline, install the new lining, because you don't have to have a pocket that jumps across this join between lining and facing. Also, it's just invisible, so it's prettier. Now let's have a look at the other jacket. This is the same kind of lining pocket. As you can see, again, there is a piping that joins the facing to the lining, and the pocket is hidden. So as you can see, this pocket adapts to either somewhat ready to wear jackets or bespoke jackets, which is what this one is. Now, we've got a lot to do, so let's learn how to do this pocket. So as you can see, we're using a piping in this particular installation. So before I get started with any kind of pattern making or construction, I'd like to show you a short tutorial on piping. The terms that I use in this tutorial will serve us when we construct this pocket. Making a piped edge is not as difficult as it looks. One of the hallmarks of a piped edge is an even thickness all along the seam and no visible stitching between the ground fabric and the piping. That's what this lesson will be covering. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. Part of the success of this project is using what I call the proper fill. Now, these three here, these are examples of the fills that I like to use. These two here, the white is rat tail, the gold is mouse tail. Rat tail is 3 millimeters wide, mouse tail is 2 millimeters. They're pretty much the same kind of cord. What I like about these is that the cord is rigid. It doesn't smash down. It's not terribly spongy. And so you can really, really get a nice smooth surface. This also has a smooth surface. Now on the smooth surface, if you're using something like a charmeuse, any other kind of fill is going to it's going to read through the fabric. The texture will read through. This has a nice smooth surface, so you are assured of an even thickness all along, and you are assured of a flat surface all along. And this here, this is what's called shoelace. Shoelace comes in a variety of diameters. It's a bias cover over a core. Again, it's not too spongy, so it makes a very firm result in the final product. You don't need a lot of fancy tools for this, but what I like is this is a generic adjustable zipper foot. This is the 1/4 inch wide. I think it's the best. Now, the reason I like this is that you turn the screw and you can adjust the foot to one side or the other of the needle, and you can adjust the foot so that the needle is either close in or right at the edge. You'll see this a little more as we go along. This particular foot, this is on an adapter for Bernina. It's a generic foot. You can get it for most machines. So, generic adjustable zipper foot, something you want to have. For the piping, I'm going to be using rat tail. And so we're assuming a 5/8 of an inch seam. So the strips will be 1¼ to 1½ inches. I'm just going to say 1 3/8 just to split the difference. There we have our bias strips. Once you've cut your bias strips, you want to press them Relax the bias.
Kenneth, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I
Sure.
have a question
Yeah,
about how
okay.
you folded the bias tape
Yeah,
to make your bias.
okay.
So you put the fabric on the bias and you fold it a couple times to get the length.
Yes. So, oh, hang on. Let me just, yeah. So what I like to do is, you find the true bias and so you fold it on the bias and you're going to have a fold here, but then I fold it 90 degrees to the bias. And you can also fold it again if you need to. Are you with me so far?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So where the ruler is, well, actually, well, yeah. So where the ruler is, once you've to find the true bias, let's just kind of start there. For those who I mean, I may be stating the obvious, but when you find the true bias, you want the cross grain to match the selvage. So when you get the cross grain to match the selvage, the fold that you create is the true bias, and that would be the fold that would be down here. So then what I like to do is fold 90 degrees to the true bias, and I've just had to fold it once on this because this is a small piece of fabric. Are you
So
with me?
is that white strip
Yeah, this is
above
the
your
selvage.
hand? That's the selvage?
That's the selvage. That's correct. And here is the cross grain here. So the bias is along here.
Okay,
Are you with me?
that orients it for me. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Does that make sense to everybody? Yes. Did that answer the question?
Yes,
Oh, good.
yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Okay. So now we're going to go back to hang on. Relaxing the bias.
Relax the bias. And from here, we'll go to the machine to fill the piping. Before filling the piping, we want to adjust the foot so that the needle is as close into the little notch as possible, the zipper foot in position number 1. I tend to like using the left side of the foot to fill piping. Some people like to use the right side, but either way, the needle is as close to the inside of that curve as you can get. Now your stitch length for filling the piping is going to be 4 to 5. You don't need a short stitch here. You just need to hold it together. Next, we lay the fill, the rat tail, on the wrong side of the fabric, and we fold. We come in here. Sometimes if you want to put a pin in there, you can. Then we lower the foot. Now, the beauty of the rat tail is that it's a rigid cord, so you can really put the edge of the foot right up next to the cord. You don't have to worry about the foot running over the cord. So you're going to get an even thickness all along the cord. So now when we sew, since the foot is in position number 1, not a final seam, when you look at the finished piping, you're going to have a little bit of slack. That's what you want, because the final seam is going to come in where my thumbnail is and be a little closer to the cord, so that all of the stitching you've used before the final seam goes into the seam allowance. Almost done. Okay, there we are. That is what we have. Our next step is to attach this to the body. So here we have our sample, and these are the right sides facing up. So I'm going to put it on the front side And I'm assuming a 5/8 inch seam. Now, this is one of those fun little things that people don't really realize, but the seam gauge here, that distance is 5/8. So what you can do, just zoom in because you really want to see this. You want see, if you notice, you can see down here that the edge of the seam gauge is a little bit past the stitching. That's what you want, because the final seam is actually going to land at the edge of the seam gauge. So when you're basting your piping down, if you're assuming a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you can use that little edge to baste. And I tend to baste with a double thread. And especially on a curve, if you really want to tightly control where that piping falls, the best way really is to baste. These basting stitches will come out later, obviously, but for the time being, they're in. Now, what you can do in here to make this go around the curve a little more readily, you can make some clips about halfway in, and then see how nicely that opens up. So again, check it as you're going around. Yeah, still good. Because you're going to baste it first. You want to baste it down. Then our next step will be at the machine, which you'll see in just a moment. So I'm going to go off camera and finish this, and I'll bring it back in just a moment. Okay. All done. From here, we go over to the machine. Now at the machine, the foot is still in position number 1. I changed threads so you can see how this works. We're still going to use a fairly long stitch for between 4 and 5. We just want to tack this down. So again, when you're steering, you can put a little bit of pressure towards the right so that the foot will ride up against the fill in the piping. So this is position number 1. This is not the final seam. We're just nailing this down.
Kenneth, what do you mean by position 1? I
It-
have a Bernina with the not adjustable zipper foot.
Okay, well, first off, you can get this for any Bernina. I actually have the adapters for the new and the old. And because the new adapters, you have to grind down a little bit to make this foot work. But what I'm talking about, and this is something that I've done in my book, position 1 is the needle is as close in to this little notch as you can get it. And then position 2, when we actually sew the final seam, the needle is going to be right at the edge of the foot. So it doesn't refer to machine settings or anything. It refers to the relationship between the needle and this particular foot. Did that make
Kenneth, could you not achieve that if you don't have that foot? Could you not achieve that with the needle position?
Not with it, well, are you talking about a Bernina machine?
Yes.
Because you see the problem using the zipper foot on a Bernina is they are designed so that the needle cannot get outside the edge of the foot. And so or the needle kind of, it's going to land inside the edge of the foot. And what I have found is I like this foot because you can get it right at the edge. You can get it ever so slightly outside the edge. But with the Bernina, adjusting the needle position on the foot, you can't really do that. That's why I like this particular foot.
Okay, thank you.
So other questions? Okay, so we will continue.
So you can see here that the orange stitching and the green stitching are pretty much on top of each other because they're both foot in position number 1. Now from the reverse, you can see the green stitching. That is the stitching we just sewed. This is going to become important in the next step. So back to the work table. So now we have both sides of this sample. So we're going to put right sides together and pin. But notice I'm pinning them together right side up so that the green stitching is visible. That is very important in the next step, because if you can see the green stitching, you don't have to really do much except steer, because you know where your stitches are going to fall. Now you could hand baste this together. You could pin it. If it's fairly complex, you would want to baste it. But for something that's fairly straightforward like this, I'm going to pin. Now I'm going to talk about pinning for just a moment. Notice I pin parallel to the seam, not perpendicular. Debates rage, but I prefer this. I find it's a little easier to manage. From here, we go back to the sewing machine. Before we begin, you can see that I have adjusted the foot so that the needle is right at the edge of the foot. This is important for what we're going to be sewing. I've also
So Paula, you can see here, the needle, you can even take it a little slightly outside the edge of that foot.
Yes.
On a Bernina, you can't do that. And that's really why I like this particular foot, because you can get that needle outside the edge of the foot if you need to. Okay?
Okay, all right.
Okay.
change the thread so you can see the net effect of what we're doing. By having the needle a little closer to the edge, it's going to be closer to the fill, and the green stitching is going to fall in the seam allowance. So we shorten the stitch to a standard 2.5. And so now, when we're sewing, we want to give it a little bit of a pull towards the right as you sew, and the foot will stop up against the rat tail. And the blue stitching will be slightly to the left of the green stitching, which is what we want. So let me show you the result. There we are. See that? That is what we want. The green stitching is position number 1. The blue stitching is position number 2. So what happens? Usually when you're making piping, you end up seeing the stitching that you used to sew the piping closed. With this, since you sew in the piping with the stitch a little further out, the final stitch will make it so that when you turn it right side out, you can pull it one way or the other, and you have a nice, snug, even thickness all along this seam and you don't see any of the stitching. But we're not done yet. What I'm doing here is staggering the notches, which you can see here, the little V shape, that's a notch. Same thing happens with clips. If you cut both seam allowances at the same place, you're going to get weird little angles when you turn it and press it. And so by staggering them so that they fall alternating, what that will do is that will ensure that your seam will press smoothly. Staggering your clips. Now let's turn this right side out. It's starting to look like something. But it's not done yet. Off to the pressing table. We begin by just pressing the seam allowance. You don't want to press all the way on top because you could leave an impression of the rat tail on the outside. And here, from here, we're going to turn this right side out. And what I like to do, instead of just putting the iron down, is I like to hit it with a little steam and then just finger press it. And then if you want to really flatten it out, then you can use your clapper. But ideally, you should not put the iron on this. I don't think it looks well because you run the risk of pressing shine into your seam allowances. And so here, is that not a thing of beauty? This is a little.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions, because now that we kind of know the piping and the terms, we can then go on to making this hidden pocket. So any questions? Okay, then.
Wait, I'm sorry. This is a kid. I have a question. You stretched the bias a little bit when you pressed it. I'm always wondering if I'm supposed to scrunch or stretch my bias.
You stretch it just a little bit. And the theory behind that, this is something my teacher Simone used to talk about, and she referred to it as cracking the bias. Bias stretches 1/4 of an inch for every 6 inches of length. So if you have, for example, a bias seam, in pattern making, we were always taught that you made the bias part of the seam shorter by 1/4 of an inch for every 6 inches. Because if you sew, say, for example, if you have a princess line to the shoulder, you have the side panel is generally more on the bias, the center panel is generally more on the straight of grain. If you cut those two seams exactly the same, what's going to happen? You're going to sew them together, you're going to press that seam, it's going to look great for about 3 days, then it's going to start rippling. And so what Simone would say is you didn't crack the bias. So what we were taught to do in pattern making was to shorten at the shoulder on the side panel 1/4 of an inch for every 6 inches. Then you put that panel on the machine or on the pressing table, and you just run the iron over it. You don't really have to stretch it. You just run the iron over it. And the action of the iron sliding along the fabric is going to crack the bias. Did that help?
Yes, I hope so.
Good. Okay. So other questions? Okay, then. So back to the story.
To the lesson on piping. This really talks about sewing the piping to a lining, which you will then sew to a facing by hand later. In this particular instance, you can see here, the orange stitches are what we used to make the piping. The green stitches are what we used to sew the piping to the lining. In this case, we sew the piping to the lining with the foot in position number 2, because that then is regarded as a final seam. So let's look at how this is done. For this example, I have made the piping using the mouse tail as opposed to the rat tail, because inside a lining, you want to reduce the bulk. This is sewn with the foot in position 1 with a rather long stitch. And we're ready to apply it to the lining. So what we'll do here is we want to place it. Now you could place this, you could hand baste it, you can pin baste it. I'm going to pin baste it just for brevity. And so the object here, and I'll zoom in a moment, is that you want the final stitch. Now let me just zoom in here. That end is 5/8 of an inch. So what I'm going to do here is lay it up so that you can see where the edge of the seam gauge meets the piping. That's where the finished stitching line is going to be. So you want to pin it or hand baste it so that the piping is in that position. I will take this off camera and pin and bring back the result. Okay, we are finished. So now that this is pinned, the next step is at the machine. So before we begin, we want to adjust the foot to position number 2. As you can see, the needle is ever so slightly inside the edge of the foot, because when we're sewing a piping to a lining, this is regarded as a final seam. This is the final time that the machine will pass over this seam. We will come in later and hand finish that. But for our purposes here, this is just an addendum. We just want to sew this to the lining fabric. Now you notice I have changed color. And as you're sewing, you make sure that the foot rides up against the rat tail. Now here, I have used a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but really, whatever seam allowance you use is all good. So I'm going to take it out of the machine, show you the result. As you can see, the green stitching, which is what we sewed in position number 2, is closer to the rat tail, leaving the orange stitching in the seam allowance. When we press that, which we will go to the pressing table and do in a moment, that is what it will look like. And this edge then will be prepared to sew to the lining. Here we are at the pressing table. And I really just like to steam and finger press. I don't really like to give this a lot of press. Like so. I want it to look soft rather than creased. So when it's finished, that's what it will look like. I don't like a hard crease there. I think it looks better with a slight roll. So back to the work table. So here we have piping installed on a lining, prepared to sew onto a facing. You can see there is the front and there is the back. Now, Let's start with the pattern making so we know how to make this pocket. When you're adding a piping to a lining, the big question is, how do you finish that end? This little tip video is going to show you that. I've marked where the hem allowance folds, and as you can see, I stopped the stitching there. So the next step is going to be measuring from there, so that's 1.25 inches. So we want to thin the rat tail so it stops at the end. So that 1.25 inches is there. We pull and measure the 1.25 inches. And if you go a little bit extra, that's okay. So then you trim that off. So the rat tail stops right there. Next step, fold this back like so. Put the right sides together and pin. Sew the layers again with the foot in position number 2. Flip the corner and then turn this right side out. So that what you'll have is a finished end on your piping, and that then accommodates the fold on the hem allowance. You get a nice clean finish right there. This is our.
So I'm gonna stop here and see if there are any questions on that. So now we get to the meat of the story. This is all the pattern making.
Sample that we're going to be creating here. So let me show you the pocket itself. Not readily apparent, but there it is. It's almost like magic, but you don't need any magic. I'm going to show you how to construct this. Here is the pattern that we're going to be using for our example. Now, what you can see here, this is the facing, this is the body front, this is the body side on the lining. The opening from A to B, that is about 6 inches, and I like to put the opening either level with the bust or slightly below, because then that will allow the contents of the pocket to settle below the bust. Now, this distance here, that is size of your hand. You want your hand to be able to go in there, or whatever objects you're going to be placing in there. Now that we have established where this sits on the lining front piece, I'm going to bring in from the side in a moment this particular piece traced off. Now, in this example, everything has seam allowances included, just so you know. So when we return, I will have the separate pattern piece ready for cutting. So as you can see here, I have traced off a separate pattern piece from the main body. This also has the seam allowances included. So now we're ready to cut fabric. I will go off camera, cut fabric, and bring back the results. So here I have the lining pieces cut, and I have cut a facing. And what I have done here is I just basted some canvas there just for the sample. So one of each of these, but the pocket itself you want 2 of these. They're cut on the fold. And what you want to do on the pocket as well as the body, you want to make snips to match it to the lining. So now that we have everything cut out, we're going to construct. One more note though, the grain line on the pocket is parallel with the opening. It's not a little bit different from the body, but I just like to have a straight of grain on this opening so that it stays that opening. Next, construction. As you can see on the lining, I have added the piping to the lining as per the instructions earlier in the video. So what I've done here is I have marked the 2 notches, point A and B, on the seam allowance so that I know what we need to match up with. So from here, get the pocket piece. And right sides together. We're going to match the notches A and B. I'll just put a pin here and a pin here. Then let me just flip this over because we will be sewing from this side. So I like to pin here as well. Okay, so that is the pocket bag that joins to the body. I like to lay these out so I don't get dyslexic. So this pocket bag gets piping. And I will pin between here and here. So I'm pinning between the 2 notches A and B. And then I'll come in here, pin this, and now both pieces are ready for the machine. For the pocket,
Yes.
Is that separate pocket, is that piping set at 5/8 inch?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And you can see here, we're sewing this with the foot in position number 2, like we did on the body of the lining.
we sew with the foot in position number 2. All the way along. Stop it right at the notch. On the body, we will start at one of the notches. We're sewing with the foot in position 2 again. And we finish at the other notch. From here, we go to the pressing table. On the pocket, bag. Before we press, we grab hold of the rat tail and we remove the rat tail. Next, we'll press this back. Like so. What this creates is a very flat bias binding. This will sew to the facing when we install the pocket. Next, clip there and clip here at the ends of the stitching. And we will press everything towards the body. And then what I like to do here is get rid of that. Serves no good purpose. And this one as well, just trim that out like so. Back to the work table. Here we have one side of the pocket sewn to the lining. We have the other lining pocket piece. Now, what you want to do next is you want to place these. And what I like to do is I like to have about 1 millimeter or so behind the folded edge on the bias strip. You don't want this to butt up against the piping. You want there to be a little bit of separation. You want that to fall behind when the pocket is in use. And so I like to pin this like that. And let me just zoom in so you can see it. As you can see, just about 1/8 of an inch between the two, all the way up. And so from here, it's a matter of pinning the pocket around the perimeter, which I will do off camera and bring back the result. So here we are, pinned. Now I'm going to show you a little something here. Notice you're going to get a little mismatch up in this area. That's as it should be. Don't sweat that. You'll trim that off later when you trim the seam allowance. But this is a direct function of giving you the gap here. You want to match the edges wherever possible. But if it mismatches a little, it's not going to kill you. Next, back to the sewing machine.
So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions. Okay.
Here we are at the machine. And we want to start the stitching right there. That's where the clip
Kenneth,
Yes,
was.
so it's 1 millimeter between the two pipings there?
that's correct.
Okay, all right.
It can be 1 millimeter to 1/8 of an inch, so 1 to 3 millimeters. But
All right.
you want this piece to sit behind the piping in the finished pocket.
Okay.
Okay.
So if you start your stitching here, and I like using the zipper foot, I find it just gives me a little more maneuverability. So then back tack. So come up here, you want to actually end up on this side of the clip. I'll trim the thread and show you the result. So that's where it looks, what it looks like on this end. And that's what it looks like on this end. Next stop, the pressing table. So everything is folded back. And what I like to do, as before, is just a little bit of steam. And this is what it will look like from this side. Now there's a couple more steps before we install this. So back to the sewing machine.
I don't want you to do that.
This is one little thing I like to do to just keep the pocket opening stable. So you can see here, I'm opening out the pocket. I'm also opening out the seam allowance. So I'm just going to be sewing through everything but the top layer. A little bar tack there. And at the opposite end. This keeps it so that there will be no strain on the pocket itself. Otherwise, you might have a little bit of strain at each one of these ends, just because you want to use the pocket. So again, see, all of the seam allowances are facing the pocket. Trim the thread, show you the result here. So there is one side. Here is the other side. You can see it goes just through the seam allowances, and of course you will trim all your threads. That gives you a little more stability at the ends of these pockets. And here you have the pocket in its final position. As you can see down here, I've pinked the seam allowance, but what I'm going to draw your attention to is this. It's called a pocket stay. Really what it is just a piece of silk organza. It can be lining fabric, and it's attached with a zigzag to the pocket bag. You can trim this out. Then it goes over and it catches into the nearest seam. Really, the reason you want to do this is that if you don't have this, the pocket will curl and cause a buckle on the inside of the garment. So this keeps the pocket nice and stable. So now, as you can see, we have the hidden lining pocket constructed. And this is what it will look like on this side. You don't see it because it's hidden. Here is the inside. So next, we want to install this onto the facing. When sewing the hidden lining pocket, I first like to sew the pocket itself, the underside of the pocket. And this is really just a slip stitch. You just catch the under layer. So you slip stitch this portion of the pocket to the facing. Much easier to sew this first. And obviously, you don't want the stitches to show from this side. So it's just a simple slip stitch. So you don't see the stitches. And I will take this off camera to finish the rest. Now that we're at the other end, you can secure the thread. See, you don't want it to see it. And then just gonna anchor that. There we go. That is what it should look like. Next, we will sew
Kenneth,
Yes,
this one first.
okay, so did you match up, the seam allowance? The
yes,
seam allowances, okay, all
yes.
right.
Because the assumption is that the facing has a 5/8 inch seam allowance too, so you just match up the cut edges.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and you can see here, I kind of skipped over this, but I like to thread baste everything down before I sew the lining in. One reason for that is that, and I discovered this the hard way, sometimes you can inadvertently ease the garment onto this edge here, and then the garment will kind of curl under. So I like to pin it. I like to baste it. I like to put it on the form or try it on to make sure that everything is hanging correctly, because it's much easier to take out this thread basting than it is to take out all the slip stitching. Okay. Okay.
And then this one. While I have it out here, you notice I have everything basted, makes it much easier to baste it rather than pinning. Sewing this piping down is a slip stitch. Now you can see here, you want to run the needle. These stitches are about 1/4 inch long. So you run the needle along the row of stitches on the piping and then catch the facing. So you can make 2 stitches at once, or you can sew them separately. This is the slip stitch.
So
And you
you
don't pull
keep
the stitch.
the cording in the piping that's on the full length of the facing, but
Yes.
you remove it from the interior pocket so that stays flat.
That's exactly right. Yes. Some people say it's a little wasteful, but you know, it is what it is. The rat tail for that one serves as a spacing device, but yes,
Yeah.
I take it off the underlayer because it then reduces the bulk.
Tight, because you don't want to create a ripple. You want it snug enough to hold everything together, but not so tight that it causes a wobble. So you're gonna watch me, because see, we're coming up to here, and there's a way of ending this at the opening of the pocket that I want you to see. Again, having that needle run just above that machine stitch is going to serve you very well. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to stop it right about there. We want to cover any untidy stitching. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch in place. This is where it helps to be ambidextrous. And we're just going to keep, we'll sew 3 or 4 times. There we go. And the beauty of this is this all will fall, it'll fall to the back. You won't see it, especially if you color match your thread. And so then here, this last stitch, this is where I just like to knot it off because you want it secure. You don't want this to cause any problems later. And then you bury the stitch, bury the end of the thread in the fabric. So, show you the result here. So if you really come in here and tug at this, you'll see the hand stitching, but in normal use, it will disappear. Now, next, I'll show you how to begin the stitches again on the other end. To secure the thread before you start sewing, it's good to come up through the layers, like about so, so that the knot stays down. So I will bring the needle through the piping. And then through the facing. And as I did on the opposite end, I want to sew 2 or 3 stitches like this so that these ends both are secure. I'll just call that. It doesn't show on this side. And then it's a slip stitch, as I did it on the other side. So it will look like that from this side, and I will continue on sewing all the way up, and I will bring you back the finished results. Now, I have removed the basting, and I'll give it a steam in just a moment. But let me show you the fruits of our labors. You can see there is where the pocket begins and where it ends. There is the pocket itself. But if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. That is why we call this the hidden pocket. And we're done.
Okay. Questions?
Well, I just want to say that looks so easy in your book.
It is.
Well, that's good to know. Yes.
Which
Yeah.
book is that?
Cool Couture.
Okay. I
Yeah, Lisa?
have that.
Yeah,
Lisa?
so my question is, so on our coat, all the seam allowances are 1/2 inch.
That's correct. Yeah.
So when we're pinning the rat tail to the edge of the lining,
Yeah. You would
We
pin it
need
at
to-
1/2 inch.
we have to do 1/2 inch, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. I saw another question, Tatiana.
How you finish other side? By machine or by hands?
What do you mean? Oh, the whole thing. If I'm putting a piping on, I take it all the way around. Then and you put the piping on by you put the piping on the lining by machine, but I would hand install that into the garment. Okay, other questions?
On both the
you-
left and the right side?
Well, I would just take it all the way around.
But
Yeah,
what
it-
I'm
I
saying, I know you hand sew the pocket edge, but the opposite edge, if you put the pocket on the right, on the left side, do you need to
All-
sew that by hand?
All hand sewn.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it's just for consistency. Okay, so Catherine, you
I
had a
was, yeah, I was just curious, could you actually machine stitch it except for the pocket opening and slip
Good,
stitch
I
that?
guess, but see, part of what I like to do when I'm making a bespoke jacket is I like to nail those facings down. So there's canvas in there. I really like to kind of nail everything down so it stays put. And so when you do that, you can't go back in by machine and sew a lining in. So putting the lining in by hand is really what's required. Okay, so other questions? I saw some hands. No hands.
Where do you purchase the rat tail and the mouse tail?
Well, the rat tail, mouse tail, this is one of those, you could, there's a place called Daytona Trims here in New York that I get things, and I think they have a website. There is Pacific Trimming here in New York City. I think you could probably just get it online. It's a fairly commonplace thing. You could probably even get it you know, at your local Joann's, because this is really a decorative cord.
It's
But-
just satin cording, right?
Yeah, just satin cording, but the technical term is rat tail and mouse tail. So, but what see, I have a bolt. I have a bolt of rat tail, I have a bolt of mouse tail because I use this a lot. And if you're buying it, you know, if you're going to be using it a lot, the bolt is not that terribly expensive. There have been times I've been able to score it for like $5 a bolt on the internet. So you don't have to
You
break
just, you look up rat tail and mouse
tail
tail?
and mouse tail on the internet. Yeah.
Okay. all
Yeah.
right.
If you do, just watch out because I just was doing it. You'll get a bunch of pest control things. So, so satin cording is where I found it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
You pest control.
Yeah.
See, that's a New York thing. You know, there
But the
are.
thing is, where you find rats, you do not find mice, and where you find mice, you do not find rats.
Well, you know, you know, this in New York, you know, there are rats.
Yeah.
And in my building, I have to say my landlady is very persnickety and very on top of any kind of pest control. And there was only one time in the entire time I've lived here that I saw what looked like rat droppings. And by God, they had the people out the next day. I've had a mouse or two in my time. There was a project I did, oh God, about 10 years ago, where I know this sounds kind of crazy, but I had to rip up some baseboards. And I got like the really, really beefy steel wool. And, you know, I bought a bale of it and I just kind of stuffed it in every little crack that I could. And, you know, knock wood, I haven't really seen any, which is, you know, because see, my husband thinks I'm terrible. You know, the sticky traps, he hates it. You know, he wants to save the mouse and get the mouse off the sticky trap and release it back into the wild. I'm like, he's not paying rent in my apartment. What I'm paying for this thing, no. And so, you know, the ones that got through, if they got stuck to a sticky trap, as much as I hate doing this, I put them in a bag, step on them. You know, I want to put them out of their misery, but, you know, I don't want them to suffer. And he thinks I'm awful, but I'm like, dude, they're not paying rent here. I don't want them here because they multiply. So
Yes.
if I'm awful, then okay, you know.
There
So
are worse things.
it's true. Yeah. I just, but yeah, I've been very lucky. My landlord she's very strict with her buildings as far as any kind of, you know, pest control. So, and in New York, that's an important thing because, you know, you get
Well,
all,
it cost me $200 a quarter to get my place sprayed for spiders.
now see, happily, I've not seen spiders here. I don't know if they live in the city or if that's, you know,
Yeah, they live where I
outside
am.
the city sort of thing. So, okay, other questions? Well, I really want to thank you all for coming to the class. It was really good to see the coats that got finished, and I'm sure that other people will be finishing their coats. And the thing to know is these recordings are going to be on YouTube for the indefinite future. So, you know, if you feel like, oh my God, I'm never going to catch up, well, you will. You know, they're going to be there. So, and if you have a question or two, email me. There's, you know, that is part of the process.
Nice.
Okay, folks. Well, I hope you enjoy you know, spring is coming. I remember like Sunday we had daylight savings time, which is like, damn. But
Did we?
I think so. Yeah.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Oh, this coming Sunday.
Coming Sunday. Yes.
Okay, I
So-
thought, oh gosh, I missed it.
No, because I keep track of it because see, I really love my sleep. And
Oh.
you know, it really kind of makes me cranky that I lose an hour of it in the spring. But you know, this is the where it's starting to get light earlier now. I start waking up earlier, and of course, like I said, you know, after this meeting with my publisher yesterday, I woke up at 5:30 this morning, like, oh my God, I got to get busy. So I'll be doing a little more of that as the time goes on. But yes.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Kenneth, so now that we've taken a class of yours, will we be on your mailing list?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
okay, perfect.
Yes. Yeah. And so the thing, because I had a gal email me and she's taken classes before, and she said, you know, I haven't been getting your emails since it's on like a blind copy list. Sometimes it ends up in your spam. So, you know, the other thing I would say is, you know, if you follow me on Instagram, I will, you know, I will give the heads up on Instagram as well, so that there are a couple of ways that you can kind of see, but you know, my guess is not until after June 1st, because like I said, I have my hands full with this book, and I have to say, I'm so damned excited about this book. I can't stand it. I was telling my students today, because I keep telling them, kids, if you know your craft, you will always have work. Sometimes it's not work you talk about, like the 5 bridesmaids dresses in 7 hours, or the little tap dancing girl costumes. But you cash the check anyway. And then sometimes there are things like this that come along that, like, they're giving me bushel baskets full of money to do this. So it makes me very, very happy. So I will be
Techniques like using freestanding lace to make your patterns, or doing custom made designs for your dolls.
What was that again?
Oh, I'm talking about for making the fabric itself. Are you going to go into any techniques like using?
Well, see, this is just because, see, they use the word series, which I like that word. So really, it's about the story, and it's about, you know, my sense is it's going to be a basic wardrobe. Yeah. So we're not going to kind of go into any deep dive in those kinds of techniques for this, because the way I figured out how to construct a lot of these things is it's a little different, because I've done a lot of looking at especially the early Barbie clothes, because I have to say, for, you know, mass-produced, well, relatively mass-produced little tiny clothes, they are marvels of construction. So, you know, I've kind of done a lot of research about how these things went together, and there are some things that I do differently, because one of the things I don't like about some of the Barbie clothes is just a turned and stitched edge, because it eventually looks kind of ratty. And so I've figured out some ways of not doing that, making the edges much more finished. So it's going to be basic tools, basic techniques, the little pressing, you know, like the little pressing boards and the little sleeve boards and that sort of thing. So that's going to be the first one.
Do we send you a box of Barbies to line up outside your door as a waiting line?
Well, you know, that's where the Orloff-Walensky triplets got their mail order husbands. A student said, I have my son's GI Joes. I'm like, okay. And they arrived in a padded envelope. So what I did is I just took the scissors and opened the envelope, and I had them like climbing out of the envelope. And I said, oh, look, the Orloff-Walensky triplets are so thrilled their mail order husbands have arrived. And that's how they got their name. They don't have names. They are the mail order husbands.
You make me so sad that I got rid of all my Barbies and GI Joes and Kens and everybody.
Well, you know, I have the ones I played with as a kid, and my cousin, God rest her soul, I have a cousin, Lori, my age, and we used to play. We were favorites, you know, and we kind of lost touch. But during the COVID, she called me, and we reestablished contact. One day she said, you know, I'm going through my storage unit. Do you want my Barbies? Like, yes, please. And so she sent me. There was Barbie, there was Casey, there was Twiggy. Remember Twiggy?
Yep.
And then there was Black Francie. And I called her and I said, okay, you know, common decency impels me to say, are you sure? Because she is worth a lot of money, like $1,200. Wow. And she said, so what was kind of cool is, you know, I mean, I remember playing with these dolls when I was a kid. So, you know, I have the ones I played with. I have the ones that I played with my cousin. The rest of them I've just acquired over the years. And one of the cool things about this whole project is everything I've spent on like little 1/6 scale, whatever, since January is a legitimate business expense.
Exactly. I'm a tax person, so I can confirm that.
It's true. I mean, I'm using these for the setup, the things for the book. So yeah, yeah. So, and I was saying that to my husband. I said, I've been spending all this money, all this time, and now I can write it off. And it's great.
Love it.
Okay, folks, I'm going to let you go on with your evening, and I'm going to download. Let me turn off the recording.